I am Zuri. 30 years ago, my biological parents walked into a state facility, handed me over with my clothes stuffed in a black trash bag, and walked out to raise the son they actually wanted. I spent decades building my own cybersecurity empire from nothing. Yesterday, they ambushed me in my own corporate lobby, demanding $50,000 to save that same son. When I laughed in their faces, my brother's new wife thought she held the winning card. She had no idea the trap she had just walked into. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire because your blood family threw you away. The elevator doors slid closed on the penthouse floor of my cybersecurity firm in downtown Atlanta, my sanctuary. I am 35 years old and standing at the helm of a company I built block by block after the passing of my adoptive mother, Gloria. The glass elevator descended smoothly, giving me a panoramic view of the city skyline. I was reviewing the final security protocols for a major banking merger on my tablet, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a hard day of work. I wore a tailored crimson suit that commanded respect in rooms full of men who consistently underestimated Black women in technology. The soft chime of the lobby floor interrupted my thoughts. The polished steel doors parted, and the pristine silence of my corporate lobby was shattered by a shrill voice I had not heard in exactly 3 decades, but instantly recognized from the darkest corners of my childhood memory. I stepped onto the cold marble floor. My lead security guard David, a former military police officer standing at 6 feet 4 inches, was actively blocking 3 African American people and a younger white woman from pushing past the biometric turnstiles. Several of my high-net-worth clients waiting in the plush seating area were staring at the commotion over their financial magazines. I paused, taking in the scene before me. There stood Desmond and Vivian, the biological parents, who had erased me from their lives so long ago. Desmond wore a suit that was perhaps expensive 10 years ago, but now hung loosely on his frame, betraying the faded arrogance of a patriarch whose small empire was rapidly crumbling. Vivian stood beside him, her face tight with artificial indignation, performing for the captive audience of my wealthy clients. Behind them stood Trey, the golden child, the biological brother they had kept, because a son carried the legacy. He looked desperate, sweating through his tailored shirt, unable to look anyone in the eye. Clinging to his arm was Lauren, his white wife, dripping with an unearned sense of authority and scanning my lobby as if evaluating its liquidation value. Vivian spotted me first. She pointed a manicured finger in my direction, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. There she is, my flesh and blood turning her back on her own family in our hour of need. She lunged forward, trying to bypass David, who firmly held out a muscular arm to stop her advance. I did not rush or show a single ounce of panic. I walked toward the security desk with slow, deliberate steps, letting the sharp click of my heels command the room. I slipped my tablet into my leather briefcase and met Desmond's gaze. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. Desmond puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the patriarchal authority he believed he held over a daughter he never raised. "We need $50,000, Zuri, and we need it today." He crossed his arms, stating it as a fact rather than a request. "Trey's logistics company is facing a temporary cash flow issue. You are an unmarried woman with more money than you know what to do with. It is your cultural duty to uplift the man of this family." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cultural duty. Uplift the man of the family. I looked at Trey, the man in question who was shifting his weight from foot to foot, while his father begged for his salvation in the lobby of the sister he replaced. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my wallet. I slowly extracted my solid platinum corporate card. Desmond's eyes locked onto the metal reflecting the lobby lights, a hungry, desperate gleam spreading across his expression. Vivian stopped shouting suddenly, arranging her face into a tight, expectant smile, believing her public performance had worked. I held the card up between my fingers, examining it closely, as if checking for smudges. Then I slipped it right back into the leather slot and snapped my wallet shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet lobby. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that made Trey flinch backward. Cultural duty, I repeated, letting the words taste like poison on my tongue. You dragged a 5-year-old girl to a group home, dumped her on the linoleum floor with a garbage bag of hand-me-downs, and told the social worker that girls cost too much and cannot carry the family legacy. You threw me away to clear the path for him. I pointed directly at Trey. And now you expect the daughter you discarded to fund the son you kept. Vivian gasped, bringing a dramatic hand to her chest. How dare you speak to your father that way? We made a sacrifice so you could have a better life. We gave you the drive to succeed. I signaled David to move them toward the revolving doors. I am not having this conversation in my lobby. Remove them, I instructed, turning my back on the pathetic display. That was when Lauren stepped around her husband. She bypassed the invisible boundary of the security line, dripping with weaponized fragility and an arrogant smirk that suggested she believed she was the smartest person in the room. Zuri, let us be reasonable here, she said, her tone condescendingly sweet, like a teacher scolding a difficult child. We know you have the money. We have been doing our research on you. We know all about the $1 million life insurance payout Gloria left you. The moment she spoke my adoptive mother's name, the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop to freezing. The mention of Gloria shifted this encounter from a pathetic nuisance to a profound threat. I stopped walking and turned back to face the woman who had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The name hung in the air like a physical threat. Gloria. My mother. The woman who actually brushed my hair, paid for my coding camps, and held my hand when the world told me I was too loud, too dark, and too ambitious. Hearing her name slide out of the smirking mouth of the woman who married the brother I was discarded for made my blood run entirely cold. The quiet murmur of my corporate lobby vanished. The soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers suddenly felt completely inadequate to mask the heavy silence that fell between us. I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between Lauren and myself. I am a woman who builds digital fortresses for international banks. My entire existence revolves around recognizing security breaches. And standing right in front of me was a massive human vulnerability. Where did you get that name? I asked. My voice did not rise above a whisper, but the absolute venom in it made Lauren step back until she bumped into Trey. Desmond stepped in front of his daughter-in-law, puffing out his chest to shield her. He adjusted the lapels of his outdated suit, attempting to look like the wealthy patriarch he so desperately wanted to be. He looked around the lobby, making sure my clients were watching, before he delivered his masterstroke. "We are not stupid, Zuri," he proclaimed loudly. "When Trey's logistics company hit a rough patch, we did what real families do. We gathered our resources and assessed our options. We hired a private investigator 6 months ago. A very expensive one, I might add." I stared at him, letting the reality of his words sink in. "You hired a private investigator," I repeated. Vivian crossed her arms, looking incredibly smug. "That is right. He dug into everything. We know about the Midtown townhouse you bought in cash last year. We know about the commercial lease you just signed for this building. And we pulled the public probate records from when your little adoptive mother passed away. We know Gloria left you a life insurance payout of exactly $1.2 million. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had not come here on a whim. They had spent half a year digitally stalking my assets, tracking my property deeds, and violating the memory of the only real mother I ever had, just to calculate exactly how much they could extort from me. "So let me get this straight," I said, sweeping my gaze over the 4 of them. "Trey is running a logistics startup into the ground. He is bleeding cash so badly that you are desperate for $50,000 today. But instead of putting your money into his failing business, you spent thousands of dollars on a private investigator to track down the daughter you threw away 30 years ago." Trey shifted uncomfortably, looking at the marble floor. "Dad, I told you this was a bad idea," he muttered. "Shut up!" Trey Desmond snapped without looking at him. He turned his attention back to me. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. Your brother needs capital to expand. It is a temporary cash flow issue. You are going to write that check because it is your obligation to this family. We gave you the gift of life, Zuri. If we had not brought you into this world, you would not have any of this. You did not give me the gift of life, Desmond, I replied, my tone dropping to freezing temperatures. You gave me a trash bag and a ride to the foster care intake center. You abandoned me so you could afford to put him through private school. I pointed at Trey, who practically shrank behind his wife. And clearly all that expensive education was a complete waste, because he is standing in my lobby begging for my money while his wife does the talking. Lauren's face turned bright red. You listen to me. She started, her voice shrill and demanding. No, you listen to me, I interrupted, cutting her off completely. I turned to my lead security guard, who was standing perfectly still, waiting for my command. David, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Vivian and Desmond. Get these people out of my building. If they resist, call the Atlanta police and press charges for trespassing and harassment. David stepped forward immediately, his hand resting near his radio. It is time to leave, folks, he said, his voice a deep, authoritative rumble. The moment David moved, the smug satisfaction on Vivian's face shattered. The mask of the concerned, loving mother fell away, completely revealing the bitter, resentful woman underneath. She realized that her public performance was not going to shame me into writing a check. She realized I was actually going to throw her out onto the street in front of my wealthy clients. You ungrateful little brat, Vivian screamed. Her voice echoed violently off the marble walls, causing two of my clients to stand up in alarm. We gave you life. We are your blood. She lunged forward, but David easily blocked her path. Frustrated and humiliated, Vivian spun around and grabbed the edge of the interactive holographic display stand near the reception desk. It was a custom-built glass structure that showcased my firm's global cybersecurity metrics. Before anyone could stop her, she shoved it with all her might. The heavy glass structure crashed to the marble floor with a deafening shatter. Shards of expensive glass and twisted metal scattered across the pristine lobby. You are a bitter, masculine woman, Vivian shrieked, pointing at me over the broken glass. Look at you in your little suit, pretending to be a man. A real woman supports her family. A real woman knows her place. You forgot where you came from because you are too arrogant to accept that you owe us everything. You will die alone, surrounded by your money, because you do not know how to submit to your own blood. The racist, misogynistic tropes poured out of her mouth like toxic sludge. She was weaponizing the very same rhetoric that every successful, independent Black woman faces when she refuses to be drained by toxic relatives. She wanted me to feel ashamed of my independence. She wanted me to feel less than a woman because I was not standing behind a failing man. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the broken glass on my floor and then back at her. David, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Add destruction of private property to the police report. David and two other security guards immediately moved in. They grabbed Desmond by the arms as he tried to push his way toward me. Another guard stepped between Vivian and the shattered display, firmly gripping her shoulders and turning her toward the exit. Trey grabbed Lauren's hand and practically ran toward the sliding glass doors, desperate to avoid being physically restrained. Get your hands off my husband, Vivian screamed, struggling against the guard. We will ruin you, Zuri. We will tell everyone in this city exactly what kind of heartless monster you really are. The automatic glass doors slid open, letting in the humid Atlanta heat and the noise of the downtown traffic. David and his team physically marched Desmond and Vivian backward through the exit. Desmond was fighting against the hold, his expensive shoes dragging against my polished floors. As they forced him out onto the concrete pavement, Desmond managed to wrench one arm free. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate rage. You think you are self-made? He shouted, his voice cracking as the glass doors began to close between us. You owe us everything. That firm you built was started with our money anyway. The heavy doors clicked shut, cutting off the rest of his words. I stood frozen in the center of the lobby, the shattered glass glittering at my feet. The silence returned to the room, but my heart was pounding violently against my ribs. My clients were staring in shocked disbelief, and the receptionist was already dialing the police. I barely noticed them. My mind was locked onto Desmond's final screaming words. That firm you built was started with our money anyway. It made absolutely no sense. I had bootstrapped this company working night shifts as a server while coding in my tiny apartment. Gloria had helped me with groceries, but she was a retired school teacher who never had thousands of dollars to hand out. The life insurance payout had only come 2 years ago, long after my firm was already established and thriving. Desmond and Vivian had never contributed a single dime to my existence since the day they dropped me off at the group home. So why would he say that? What money was he talking about? I turned away from the glass doors, my mind racing through 1,000 different possibilities. As a forensic cybersecurity expert, I do not believe in coincidences, and I certainly do not ignore anomalies in data. Desmond was a greedy, arrogant man, but he was not creative enough to invent a specific financial claim out of thin air while being dragged out of a building. He believed what he was saying. He genuinely believed I had his money. I walked past the ruined display and headed straight for the private elevator. I did not need to wait for the police. Security could handle the property damage report. I had a much more urgent problem to solve. I needed to know exactly what financial ghost from my past was currently haunting my present. I marched straight past the shattered glass of the lobby display with my heels striking the marble floor in a lethal rhythm. I did not look back at the revolving doors. I did not need to see Desmond and Vivian being physically escorted onto the Atlanta pavement to know they were gone. The physical threat was neutralized, but the psychological grenade Desmond had thrown right before the doors closed was still ticking in my mind. You owe us everything. That firm you built was started with our money anyway. I pushed through the heavy frosted glass doors of my executive suite and let them slam shut behind me. The soundproofing instantly cut off the distant murmur of the lobby cleanup. My office was a fortress of dark wood and brushed steel overlooking the city skyline. I threw my leather briefcase onto the sofa and paced the length of the room. My fiancé and business partner Isaiah followed right behind me. He locked the door and immediately walked over to his workstation. Isaiah is a man of few words and terrifying capability. Before we launched this cybersecurity firm together, he spent 8 years as a forensic auditor tracking laundered money for federal agencies. He knows how people hide their sins, and he knows how to drag those sins into the light. He did not ask me if I was okay. He knew I was not okay. He knew I was furious, and he knew exactly how to channel that fury into something productive. Did you hear what he said? I asked, my voice sharp and vibrating with adrenaline. Desmond claimed I built this company with his money. That makes absolutely no sense. I built this firm with my bare hands. I coded our first proprietary encryption software on a refurbished laptop while working double shifts at a data center. Isaiah dropped into his ergonomic chair and woke up his massive dual-monitor terminal. His fingers were already flying across the mechanical keyboard. Desmond is arrogant, but he is not creative, Isaiah said, his eyes scanning lines of code and secure login portals. A narcissist like your biological father does not invent a specific financial claim while being dragged out of a building by security. He said it because in his twisted reality he believes it is true. He believes he gave you capital. I leaned over Isaiah's desk, bracing my hands on the cool metal edge. He gave me nothing, I fired back. When Gloria took me in out of the foster system, she was a retired public school teacher living on a fixed pension. We clipped coupons. She took on evening tutoring sessions just to afford our dial-up internet so I could teach myself how to program. She gave me unconditional love and a safe home, but she never had thousands of dollars to hand out. The only real money I ever received was the life insurance payout Gloria left me when she passed away 2 years ago. And by then, our firm was already clearing 8 figures in revenue. Exactly. Isaiah murmured, his eyes locked on the glowing screens. Which means the money Desmond is talking about did not come from Gloria. It came from him, or at least it was filtered through him. We are not waiting for the legal department to file discovery motions. I am pulling your sealed adoption files right now. I watched as Isaiah bypassed standard bureaucratic channels. We operate a top-tier cybersecurity firm with authorized access to municipal databases for threat assessment. Isaiah utilized those backdoor channels to dive directly into the Fulton County archived public records. He was not looking for my current financial status. He was digging back 30 years into the sealed vault of my past. The dual monitors reflected in his dark eyes as folders and digitized microfiche files began to populate the screen. We need to look at the financial disclosures filed when you became a ward of the state, Isaiah explained, his voice dropping into that hyper-focused tone he used when dismantling a hacker's network. When Desmond and Vivian surrendered their parental rights, the state required a full financial affidavit to prove they could not provide for you. I crossed my arms, gripping my elbows tight to stop my hands from shaking. They told the social worker that keeping me would bankrupt them, I said, reciting the painful truth I had read in my juvenile file years ago. They said a daughter was a financial burden they could not bear while trying to establish Trey as the heir to Desmond's logistics business. They claimed poverty to justify throwing me away. Let us see how poor they really were, Isaiah muttered. He cracked a digitized encryption lock on a set of banking records from the early 1990s. Line after line of green text scrolled down the black terminal window. Isaiah paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His jaw tightened. He opened a secondary window and initiated a cross-reference search using my original birth certificate name and my social security number. He pulled up historical property deeds, shell company registrations, and offshore routing numbers. The sheer volume of data he was aggregating in a matter of minutes was staggering. Zuri. Look at this, Isaiah said, his tone completely devoid of emotion. That is never a good sign. I walked around the desk and stood behind him, staring at the screen. He highlighted a specific legal entity. A trust fund. It had been established 3 days after I was born. I traced the names on the scanned document. The benefactor was Marcus Vance. That is Desmond's father, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. My biological grandfather. I never met him. He died when I was an infant. He owned a chain of successful barbershops and commercial real estate on the south side of the city. He was a smart man, Isaiah said, pulling up the terms of the trust. He knew his son was a grifter. Marcus bypassed Desmond entirely. He liquidated a massive portion of his commercial real estate and placed the cash directly into an irrevocable trust meant exclusively for his only granddaughter. You. The documents state that the money was meant for your education, your housing, and your future business endeavors. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather had wanted to protect me. He had secured my future before I could even walk. He had looked at his greedy son and decided to shield me from him. But I never saw a dime of that money, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I went to public school in worn-out sneakers. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my certifications. Where did the money go? Isaiah brought up this banking ledger. Because you were a minor, the trust required a custodian until you turned 18. Desmond was named the custodian, but the trust had strict parameters. Funds could only be withdrawn with documented proof that the money was directly benefiting your welfare. Isaiah clicked a button and a series of withdrawal slips filled the right side of the screen. They were dated 30 years ago. I watched the numbers escalate. $10,000, $50,000, $100,000. Desmond and Vivian forged the welfare documents, Isaiah explained, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. They submitted fake invoices for private medical care, elite boarding schools, and intensive childhood therapies you never received. They created shell companies to act as the vendors. They invoiced the trust and paid themselves. I stared at the screen, completely paralyzed by the depth of their depravity. They did not just throw me away because they preferred a son. They systematically robbed a toddler. Isaiah opened the final withdrawal slip. It was a massive transfer that emptied the very last drop of capital from the account. He checked the date and cross-referenced it with my foster care intake forms. He stopped typing and let his hands fall into his lap. The silence in my office was deafening. He slowly turned his chair around to face me, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. "Zuri," he said, his voice heavy with a cold, terrifying rage. "Your biological grandfather left a $250,000 trust in your name when you were born. Desmond and Vivian drained it completely exactly 1 week before they surrendered you to the state." The ballroom at the St. Regis Atlanta hummed with the kind of electric, vibrant energy that only comes from genuine triumph. I stood backstage, adjusting the diamond cuffs of my emerald silk evening gown, listening to the ambient roar of 300 brilliant minds networking over crystal flutes of champagne. This was my night. I had personally funded and organized this exclusive gala to honor young African American female tech entrepreneurs. These were women breaking glass ceilings in a corporate world deliberately designed to keep them locked in the basement. As I looked out from the velvet wings, I saw a room full of absolute black excellence. Venture capitalists, angel investors, and software engineers traded ideas under the warm glow of cascading crystal chandeliers. My fiancé Isaiah stood near the front tables looking flawless in a midnight blue tuxedo. He caught my eye and offered a subtle grounding nod of encouragement. Everything was executing exactly according to plan. My cybersecurity firm was weeks away from closing a highly publicized multi-million-dollar merger with a global tech conglomerate, and tonight was the ultimate victory lap to solidify our standing in the industry. My adoptive mother, Gloria, would have been overwhelmingly proud. The event coordinator handed me a sleek wireless microphone signaling my cue. I walked out onto the main stage to thunderous applause, stepping into the warm glare of the spotlights. I began my keynote address speaking passionately about resilience, about building impenetrable fortresses when the world refuses to give you a single brick. I spoke about the unique, heavy challenges we face as Black women in technology, constantly defending not just digital networks, but our own rightful places in the boardroom. The audience was completely captivated. Every single eye in the room was locked on the stage, absorbing the message of empowerment. That was when I spotted the disturbance at the main entrance. From my elevated vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the VIP check-in desk at the far end of the ballroom. My security team was dealing with a frantic, highly animated guest. It was Lauren. Even from 100 feet away, I could read her entire manipulative playbook. She was actively weaponizing her white tears, playing the flustered innocent victim who had tragically lost her invitation and felt deeply intimidated by the strict security protocols of a predominantly Black event. She was waving her hands, speaking loudly, drawing the attention of 2 additional guards who rushed over to de-escalate the situation. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was deliberately creating a massive, loud blind spot. While my security personnel were completely distracted trying to calm down a hysterical white woman in a high-end hotel lobby, the heavy velvet service doors near the east wall slipped open. Trey walked right through the service entrance, smoothing down the lapels of a rented tuxedo that did not quite fit his shoulders. My blood ran freezing cold, but I kept my voice perfectly steady, delivering my speech without missing a single beat. I could not stop my keynote address without causing a massive public scene, which was exactly what they were counting on. I watched Trey navigate the perimeter of the ballroom, his eyes scanning the tables of wealthy investors like a starving wolf evaluating a pasture. He marched purposefully down the center aisle, heading straight for the stage with an air of unearned authority. I tried to accelerate my closing remarks, hoping to exit the stage before he reached me, but Trey was already ascending the side stairs. He projected an aura of slick confidence, flashing that identical golden child smile that had allowed him to manipulate our biological parents for 3 entire decades. He walked right up to my podium, cutting off my final sentence, and literally wrapped his hand around my microphone. He pulled it firmly from my grip. I froze, maintaining my professional composure, rapidly calculating the exact level of damage control I would need to execute. "Good evening, beautiful people," Trey announced, his voice booming through the ballroom speakers. He threw a heavy arm around my stiff shoulders, pulling me into a suffocating, entirely fabricated side hug. "I am Trey Zuri's older brother, the the man who has had her back since day one. Let us give it up for my amazing little sister building her empire and making the family proud. The audience, assuming this was a planned, heartwarming family tribute, clapped politely. Isaiah, however, immediately stepped away from his table, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he recognized the physical threat. Trey did not hand the microphone back. Instead, he pivoted away from me to face the crowd of billionaires and venture capitalists. Zuri has always talked about community. Trey continued, his voice dripping with fake sincerity and practiced charm. About pulling others up as you climb the ladder of success. That is a core value our parents instilled in us, and that is exactly why I am standing here before you tonight. I am launching a massive community empowerment venture, a logistics firm dedicated to employing at-risk youth right here in Atlanta. But to make this dream a reality, to truly uplift our people, I need dedicated partners. I need seed capital. And looking out at all this immense wealth tonight, I know I am in the right room to find my founding investors. He was grifting them. He was openly leveraging my hard-earned professional reputation, standing on my stage to scam my esteemed guests into paying off his underground loan shark debts. The sheer unadulterated violation of it made my vision blur with absolute rage. I did not scream. I did not fight him for the microphone. I simply made direct eye contact with the lead sound engineer stationed at the soundboard in the back of the room. I gave a sharp horizontal swipe of my hand across my throat. The sound system popped, and the microphone went dead instantly. Trey kept talking for 3 more seconds before realizing his voice was no longer echoing through the cavernous ballroom. He tapped the microphone grill twice. Nothing but hollow, muted thuds resounded. The polite smiles in the audience began to falter quickly, replaced by confused murmurs and uncomfortable shifting in their seats. Trey turned to me, the charismatic smile evaporating from his face, leaving behind something ugly, volatile, and deeply desperate. He took a heavy step into my personal space, completely abandoning the supportive brother facade. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging brutally into my bare skin, bruising the muscle. Isaiah saw the aggressive physical contact and immediately broke into a sprint toward the stage, signaling the remaining security guards to follow his lead. Trey leaned his face down, his jaw tight, his breath hot against my ear. The venom in his voice was thick and unmistakable. "You are going to write me a cashier's check for $50,000 by Friday afternoon," Trey whispered, his grip tightening until my arm throbbed with sharp pain. "You are going to hand it over, or Lauren goes straight to the press tomorrow morning. Mom and Dad kept files on you, Zuri. We have your medical and psychological evaluations from when you were 4 years old. Official state documents proving you were a violent, unhinged, dangerous child. We will paint you as a literal sociopath." I stared at him, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the threat. They were forged. They had to be entirely fabricated. Gloria had told me I was a quiet, terrified child when she brought me home from the foster system. But in the ruthless corporate world, the actual truth matters significantly less than the optics of a scandal. "We will leak every single page to the tech blogs," Trey hissed, his eyes wild with financial desperation. "We will send them directly to the board of directors at the conglomerate you are trying to merge with. They will see that you are mentally unstable and violently unpredictable. The scandal will ruin your spotless reputation, and it will completely tank your merger. 50 grand by Friday, Zuri, or you lose your entire empire." Isaiah did not shout. He did not throw a punch. He simply clamped his hand onto the back of Trey's neck with a grip that resembled an industrial steel vise. The pressure must have been agonizing, because Trey instantly stopped speaking, and his knees buckled slightly. I maintained a serene, immaculate smile for the crowd of venture capitalists and tech billionaires staring up at us. I turned to the nearest table of investors, offering a light, dismissive laugh that conveyed absolute control. "My brother and I needed a moment to catch up," I announced, my voice projecting warmly into the front row without the aid of a microphone. "Family dynamics are always so passionate. Enjoy the champagne, everyone. We will be right back." I turned sharply and marched toward the side of the stage. Isaiah propelled Trey forward, using his grip on Trey's neck to steer him like an unruly child. Lauren scrambled after them, her face flushed with a mixture of indignation and panic. We bypassed the catering staff and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP green room. The second the door clicked shut, the ambient roar of the gala vanished entirely. Isaiah shoved Trey forward, sending him stumbling onto a plush leather sofa. Isaiah turned around and locked the deadbolt. The heavy metallic click echoed through the soundproof room like the ceiling of a vault. "You cannot assault my husband!" Lauren shrieked, rushing over to Trey, who was vigorously rubbing the back of his neck. "I am calling the police right now. We are VIP guests and you are treating us like criminals." "You bypassed event security using a fake name and hijacked a corporate keynote address," I replied, crossing my arms and standing perfectly still. "Call the Atlanta police, Lauren. I beg you to make that call. Let us explain to the authorities exactly how you bypassed a security checkpoint at a high-net-worth corporate event. I am sure the hotel management would love to press charges for trespassing." Lauren froze her thumb, hovering over the screen of her phone. She knew she was bluffing, and she knew that my security team had every legal right to detain them. She slipped her phone back into her oversized designer clutch, but she did not back down. Instead, her expression hardened into a mask of pure, calculated malice. She reached deeper into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She tossed it onto the glass coffee table, separating us. "We do not need the police," Lauren said, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. "We just need the compliance officers at the tech conglomerate you are trying to merge with. We know all about the acquisition, Zuri. We know you are weeks away from cashing out for 9 figures. And we know that massive corporate mergers require the CEO to undergo intensive vetting. Boards of directors hate volatility, they hate scandal, and they absolutely despise instability in their leadership." I looked down at the envelope, but I did not reach for it. "What exactly do you think you have in there, Lauren?" She smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why do you not open it and find out?" I picked up the envelope and unspooled the string tie. I pulled out a stack of medical records printed on yellowing paper. The letterhead belonged to a pediatric psychiatric clinic that had closed down 2 decades ago. I scanned the first page. It was an evaluation detailing my behavior at 4 years old. The text described me as prone to violent, unprovoked rages. It claimed I lacked fundamental human empathy. It diagnosed a toddler with severe antisocial personality disorder and listed me as an unmanageable danger to myself and others. The documents were a masterclass in character assassination. They painted a picture of a deeply disturbed child who was destined to become a sociopathic adult. They were designed to provide the perfect legal and moral cover for parents who wanted to abandon their daughter without facing judgment from the state. "These are the files your parents submitted to the state when they surrendered you," Lauren explained, taking a step forward to ensure I was absorbing every word. "They kept copies. Official medical documentation proving that you are violently unpredictable. Imagine what happens when I send these PDFs to TechCrunch. Imagine the headline. Cybersecurity, CEO Zuri Vance, hidden history of severe psychological instability. Your corporate partners will drop you so fast your head will spin. The merger will be dead in the water." Trey leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, attempting to look authoritative despite nursing a bruised neck. "We do not want to ruin you, Zuri. We are family. I just need a small injection of capital to save my logistics company. Pay the 50 grand and this entire folder goes straight into a shredder. Consider it an investment in your own future." I stared at the fraudulent documents in my hand. I was a quiet, terrified child when Gloria brought me home. I hid under tables and barely spoke for 6 months. I was not violent. I was broken. Desmond and Vivian had paid a corrupt doctor to falsify these records so they could wash their hands of me without consequence. They created a fictional monster to justify their own monstrous choices. And now their golden child and his wife were trying to use that same fiction to extort the empire I built from nothing. The sheer blinding audacity of it made the air in my lungs turn to ash. I slammed the papers down onto the glass table with such sudden explosive force that both Trey and Lauren jumped back. The documents scattered across the floor, sliding over the expensive rug. "You think a fake 30-year-old psych eval scares me?" I demanded, my voice vibrating with a lethal, quiet fury. I stepped directly into Trey's personal space, forcing him to press his back against the leather sofa. You gave me away because Desmond wanted a boy. You threw me out like garbage so you could clear the path for the mighty son and heir. And you did not just abandon me, Trey. You robbed me. You used my $250,000 trust fund to buy that McMansion in Buckhead. Trey's face drained of color. The arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted toward Isaiah and then back to me. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Lauren frowned, looking genuinely confused. She glanced down at her husband. Trey, what is she talking about? What trust fund? Your husband's parents are thieves, Lauren Isaiah said, speaking for the first time since we entered the room. His voice was cold and precise, dropping data points like heavy stones. Marcus Vance set up an irrevocable trust for Zuri 3 days after she was born. Desmond and Vivian forged medical invoices, created shell companies, and drained $250,000 from a toddler exactly 1 week before they dumped her into the foster care system. They committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny. I added my eyes, never leaving Trey's pale, sweating face. And the statute of limitations on fraud involving a minor does not begin until the minor discovers the crime. Which means I can hand this entire financial paper trail over to the district attorney tomorrow morning and send your parents to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. Trey swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Zuri, you cannot do that. They are old. They would not survive prison. You have to listen to reason. I am listening to reason, Trey, I whispered, leaning closer. And reason dictates that I should crush you into absolute dust. I expected them to shatter. I expected them to beg for mercy and run for the exit. But I underestimated the depth of Lauren's entitlement and her absolute detachment from reality. She did not care about Desmond and Vivian going to prison. She only cared about her own immediate financial survival. Lauren stepped right over the scattered forged documents on the floor and planted herself between Trey and me. Her face was tight with desperate, vicious defiance. She tilted her chin up, refusing to break eye contact. It does not matter if it is fake? Lauren smirked, entirely unfazed by the threat of federal prison for her in-laws. The internet does not care about the truth, Zuri. They only care about the headline. By the time your lawyers prove these documents are forged, the damage will already be done. The scandal will ruin your merger. $50,000 by Friday, or you lose your empire. I stared at Lauren's smug face, evaluating the sheer delusion required to threaten a cybersecurity expert with a digital leak. She actually believed she held the winning hand. She thought the prospect of a public relations nightmare would force me into submission because she operated in a world where appearances were everything. I operate in a world where data is everything. And I knew her data was weak. I did not blink. I did not falter. I leaned in so close I could smell the expensive, heavy perfume she used to mask her desperation. I do not negotiate with terrorists, I whispered, my voice a razor-sharp blade slicing through the quiet tension of the green room. And I certainly do not negotiate with amateurs. I stood up straight and smoothed the front of my emerald silk gown. I signaled Isaiah with a brief nod. He stepped back from the heavy mahogany door, unlocking the deadbolt and pulling it wide open. The ambient noise of the gala instantly flooded back into the room. Get out of my venue before I have you both arrested for criminal extortion, I commanded, pointing toward the exit. Trey looked absolutely terrified, his eyes darting toward the open door like a trapped animal calculating its escape route. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and he knew he had vastly overplayed his hand. But Lauren simply scoffed, adjusting her designer clutch with an air of arrogant finality. She grabbed Trey by the arm, her heels clicking furiously against the hardwood floor as she dragged her husband out of the room. Friday, Zuri, she called over her shoulder. You know where to send the wire. The second the door swung shut behind them, the gala and its 300 VIP guests faded into the background. I pulled out my phone and messaged my chief of operations, instructing her to handle the remainder of the event and manage the closing networking session. I was done making polite conversation with venture capitalists. Isaiah and I bypassed the main ballroom entirely, slipping through the service corridors and taking the secure freight elevator straight down to the subterranean parking garage. Within 20 minutes, we were back in the glass-walled sanctuary of our corporate headquarters. The city lights of downtown Atlanta sprawled out below us, but my focus was entirely on the glowing monitors of our primary command terminal. We were not going to wait for Friday. We were not going to play defense against people who built their entire lives on a foundation of lies. We were going to dismantle them completely, and we were going to do it tonight. Isaiah dropped his tuxedo jacket onto the leather sofa and rolled his sleeves up to his elbows. He dropped into his ergonomic chair and cracked his knuckles. It was a familiar rhythmic sound that always signaled a digital demolition. Trey called his venture a community empowerment logistics startup, I said, pulling up the remarkably thin public footprint of his business on my tablet. He stood on my stage and begged billionaires for seed capital. Let us see what he is actually moving. Isaiah did not even bother with sophisticated phishing tactics or prolonged social engineering. Trey was a careless man, and careless men leave their digital front doors wide open. Isaiah launched a relentless brute force sequence against the tragically outdated firewall, protecting Trey's company servers. It took less than 90 seconds for the encryption to completely shatter. We were inside his internal network, swimming through a chaotic sea of disorganized digital ledgers, panicked internal memos, and overdue invoices. I leaned over Isaiah's shoulder, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted accounts payable folders populating the screen. The financial math was absolutely atrocious. Trey was not just bleeding cash, he was completely hemorrhaging it. But the $50,000 he had aggressively demanded did not align with any standard vendor debt or payroll shortage. I pointed to a recurring escalating payment routing to an unmarked LLC. Trace that specific node, I instructed. Isaiah ran the trace, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as he bypassed basic banking masks. The LLC was a total ghost. It was a shell company tied directly to a shadow lender operating out of a rundown strip mall in Marietta. Trey was not seeking expansion capital to uplift the youth of Atlanta. He was in bed with an underground syndicate, and he was severely behind on his payments. But it gets infinitely worse. Isaiah murmured, his voice tight. He pulled up the collateral agreement attached to the shadow loan and opened the scanned PDF on the main monitor. I stared at the screen, analyzing the legal jargon. To secure the exorbitant cash loan, Trey had leveraged a physical property. I looked at the address listed on the document, and a bitter, humorless laugh escaped my throat. It was the sprawling McMansion in Buckhead, the exact same house Desmond and Vivian had purchased 30 years ago using my stolen trust fund. The shadow lender had already initiated private foreclosure proceedings. If Trey did not deliver the $50,000 by the end of the month, the syndicate was going to seize the house and leave our biological parents entirely homeless. They were desperate, I said, analyzing the sheer terrifying panic that must have driven them to crash a highly secured event. Trey is staring down the barrel of a shadow syndicate, and Desmond is about to lose the house he bought with my money. But Lauren was too calm. Isaiah stopped typing and looked up at me. You noticed that too. She was entirely too confident for a woman about to lose her house and her husband's failing business. I continued pacing behind the terminal. She stood in that green room and smirked at me. She threatened to blow up my corporate merger without a single ounce of fear. A woman does not act like that when her ship is sinking unless she already has a life raft secured. She has a safety hatch. Dig into her personal routing numbers. Pull her individual device logs. Isaiah immediately isolated the IP address associated with Lauren's mobile device. It was the same phone she had proudly clutched at the gala. He bypassed her personal encryption, sifting through her digital footprint with clinical precision. She was smarter than Trey, but she was not a ghost. Isaiah found a hidden locked folder buried deep beneath layers of commercial VPNs and dummy IP addresses. It was a chain of highly encrypted email threads. Isaiah ran a custom decryption script, the terminal flashing rapidly as it translated the cipher into readable text. When the formatting finally normalized, Isaiah turned the monitor around to face me. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. Zuri, he said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. Lauren is not trying to save the family. I leaned in and read the intercepted emails. The correspondence was between Lauren and a private wealth manager based in Switzerland. She had established a highly secure offshore account in Geneva using a maiden name and a forged passport. For the past 8 months, she had been systematically embezzling every single dollar she could quietly siphon from Trey's fraudulent business loans and Desmond's dwindling retirement accounts. She had booked a one-way first-class ticket to Paris, departing this coming Saturday. She had already secured a luxury flat in the city, utilizing the stolen funds as a massive down payment. In one specific email, she openly mocked Trey's sheer stupidity, bragging to her wealth manager about how easy it was to drain the accounts while her husband panicked over the shadow lenders. The $50,000 she was extorting from me was not going to pay off the syndicate. It was not going to save the Buckhead mansion. It was the final deposit for her secret exit strategy. She was planning to take my money board, an international flight, and leave Trey, Desmond, and Vivian to completely burn. I stared at the glowing monitor illuminating Isaiah's face in the darkened office. The digital trail was undeniable. Lauren was not a desperate wife trying to salvage her husband's failing logistics company. She was a calculated parasite silently draining the final remaining drops of blood from a host she was actively preparing to abandon. She had the offshore accounts. She had the forged passport. She had the first-class ticket to Paris booked for Saturday morning. The $50,000 she was currently attempting to extort from me was the final piece of capital she needed to secure her European escape route. She stood in my VIP green room at the gala an hour ago and threatened to completely destroy my corporate reputation with forged psychological evaluations from my childhood. She looked me directly in the eyes and demanded $50,000 by Friday. She assumed I would panic. She assumed that, like Trey and Desmond, I was easily manipulated by the threat of public embarrassment. She had no idea that she had just handed a forensic cybersecurity expert the exact blueprint required to dismantle her entire existence. "I do not negotiate with terrorists," I said, my voice, a low, steady hum in the quiet office. "And I absolutely never negotiate with amateurs." Isaiah leaned back in his ergonomic chair, interlacing his fingers. His eyes were dark and completely focused. "So how do we want to play this? We have the wire fraud documentation regarding your stolen trust fund. We have the proof of Lauren's embezzlement. We have the shadow syndicate foreclosure notices on Desmond's house. We can drop this entire digital package on the district attorney's desk tomorrow morning and let the federal authorities sweep them up." "No," I replied, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. "Handing this to the authorities right now gives them time to scramble. It gives Lauren time to board that flight to Paris before the bureaucratic wheels of the justice system start turning. They brought this fight into my professional sanctuary. They threatened my firm. They threatened my merger. We are going to handle this in-house. We are going to execute a total network quarantine." I pulled my phone from the pocket of my emerald silk gown. I unlocked the screen and navigated to the family group chat that I had muted and ignored for years. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. "If you want to trap a predator, you have to offer them the exact bait they are currently starving for. They wanted me to surrender. I was going to give them a masterpiece of a surrender." I typed out a carefully constructed message, stripping away all of my usual authority and replacing it with a tone of defeated resignation. "You win," I typed. "I cannot risk the corporate merger falling through because of a public scandal. I will write the check. Come to my firm's executive boardroom this Friday at 4 in the afternoon. You will bring the original copies of the psychological evaluations. I will have a $50,000 cashier's check waiting for you. You will all sign a strict non-disclosure agreement before the money is handed over. Do not contact me before then." I hit send. The response was almost instantaneous. The digital read receipts illuminated, showing that Trey, Lauren, Desmond, and Vivian had all viewed the message within seconds. They had been sitting by their phones, waiting for my resolve to break. Trey was the first to reply. His text was dripping with that same fake, slick corporate charm he had attempted to use on my stage. "I knew you would see reason, Zuri. This is just a temporary capital injection. Family protects family. See you Friday." Vivian chimed in exactly 30 seconds later. Her message was a masterclass in toxic passive aggression. A mother's love always wins. I am glad you finally remembered where you came from and who you owe your success to. God bless. Desmond sent a simple thumbs up emoji followed by a brief text. Glad you remembered your place. Lauren remained entirely silent. She did not send a single word to the group chat. She did not need to gloat. She was too busy calculating her exchange rates and finalizing her packing list for Paris. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the glass desk. The sheer psychological satisfaction of knowing exactly how smug they felt in this exact moment was intoxicating. They were currently sitting in their respective homes believing they had successfully broken me. They believed they had outsmarted a woman who built digital fortresses for international banks. Let them celebrate, I said, turning back to Isaiah. We have 72 hours to prepare the boardroom. Call the legal team. The next 3 days were a masterclass in corporate warfare preparation. I treated my family exactly like a high-level malware infection. I did not operate out of anger or emotional distress. I operated with surgical clinical precision. I brought in my lead corporate counsel, Marcus, an incredibly sharp attorney who specialized in aggressive corporate litigation and hostile takeovers. I sat Marcus down in my office and laid out the entire situation. I explained the extortion attempt, the forged childhood evaluations, the stolen trust fund, and Lauren's impending international flight. Marcus did not blink. He simply pulled out his legal pad and started drafting the necessary documentation to spring the trap. We need the boardroom completely wired, Marcus advised, pacing the length of my office. Georgia is a one-party consent state regarding audio and video recording. Because you are the primary owner of this corporate space and you are a consenting party to the conversation, we can legally record every single word they say without disclosing the cameras. When they attempt to extort you on tape, we will have bulletproof leverage. I authorized the surveillance upgrade immediately. My internal security team worked after hours outfitting the executive boardroom with state-of-the-art, high-definition hidden cameras. They embedded the lenses seamlessly into the overhead smoke detectors, the interactive whiteboard bezels, and the central conference call hardware on the mahogany table. Every single angle of the room was covered. Every breath, every whisper, and every threat would be captured in crystal-clear digital resolution. While security handled the hardware, Marcus focused on the paperwork. The non-disclosure agreement I had promised them in the text message was an absolute decoy. Marcus drafted a brilliantly disguised legal confession. Hidden within the dense, exhausting paragraphs of standard corporate legalese was a binding admission of guilt. By signing the document to receive the check, Trey and Lauren would be legally admitting to utilizing forged medical documents for the purpose of financial extortion. Isaiah took charge of the physical evidence. He spent 48 straight hours compiling the digital artifacts he had hacked from their various networks. He printed the documents on high-quality premium paper and bound them into 4 identical black leather portfolios. He placed the Shadow Syndicate loan documents right next to the property deed for Desmond's house, proving the imminent foreclosure. He printed the original banking ledgers from my stolen trust fund, highlighting the exact dates my biological parents had siphoned the $250,000 into their own pockets. Finally, he compiled a devastating section dedicated entirely to Lauren. He printed her offshore Swiss banking routing numbers, the deed to her newly acquired Paris flat, and the first-class flight confirmation scheduled for the morning after our Friday meeting. He placed one black leather folder at each seat around the mahogany conference table. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was the promise of a $50,000 check. The jaws of the trap were the bound leather folders sitting quietly in front of their assigned chairs. It was late Thursday night, just 12 hours before the scheduled confrontation. The office was completely empty except for Isaiah and me. The city lights of Atlanta filtered through the executive windows, casting long shadows across the pristine boardroom. I was standing at the head of the mahogany table, tracing my fingers over the smooth wood, mentally rehearsing the sequence of events for tomorrow afternoon. Isaiah was sitting at his terminal in the adjoining office, running one final comprehensive sweep of the archived data. In our line of work, you never assume your intelligence gathering is complete. You constantly verify the data to ensure absolutely zero blind spots exist. He wanted to cross-reference the name of the disgraced pediatric doctor who had signed my forged psychological evaluations back in the 1990s. I heard the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard suddenly stop. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20. Zuri, Isaiah called out. His voice lacked its usual steady calm. It sounded tight and strangely hollow. Come look at this. I left the boardroom and walked into his office. The ambient glow of the dual monitors illuminated his face. He was not looking at the forged psychological evaluations. He had opened a secondary portal, accessing the archived municipal health department registries from Fulton County. I was tracing the doctor's medical license to see if he had faced malpractice charges during that decade, Isaiah explained, gesturing to the screen. To verify his signature, I had to pull the corresponding hospital intake forms from the dates he claimed to have evaluated you. The system automatically queried the maternal ward records linked to Vivian and Desmond's names to verify the family medical history. He pointed to a digitized scan of a faded hospital document. It was a birth certificate and a corresponding neonatal blood registry form. The date was 33 years ago. 3 years before I was born. It was Trey's birth record. Look at the blood typing, Isaiah instructed, his finger tracing the faded typewritten lines. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the medical data. Vivian was listed as O negative. That matched the family medical history I had been provided by the state. Desmond was listed as a B positive. I looked down at the neonatal blood type recorded for Trey just hours after his birth. Trey was listed as O positive. I stared at the screen, my forensic background instantly recognizing the biological impossibility staring back at me. A mother with O negative blood and a father with a B positive blood can produce an A or a B blood type child. They absolutely cannot produce an O positive child. The genetic mathematics were entirely incompatible. I felt the air pull out of the room. The sheer magnitude of the secret buried in this 30-year-old municipal scan was world-altering. My entire life I had been told that I was discarded because Trey was the golden child. I was thrown away like absolute garbage because I was a girl and Desmond needed his legitimate son and heir to carry on his legacy and his business. They had stolen my trust fund to support him. They had built their entire identity around the supremacy of the firstborn son. Isaiah turned in his chair, looking up at me. The glow of the monitor reflected the complete shock in his eyes. Zuri, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. Trey is not Desmond's biological son. Friday afternoon arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of Atlanta, but inside my executive boardroom, the temperature was absolute zero. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the downtown traffic crawl along the pavement. Isaiah stood beside me, immaculate, in a charcoal suit, finalizing the digital recording interface on his tablet. The hidden cameras embedded in the smoke detectors and conference hardware were completely undetectable, silently capturing every square inch of the mahogany table. We had spent Thursday night processing the monumental genetic secret buried in those 30-year-old municipal scans. Vivian had betrayed Desmond, passed off another man's child as his heir, and then convinced him to throw me away to protect her golden boy. The sheer magnitude of the deception was almost elegant in its pure toxicity. But today was not about confronting family trauma. Today was about corporate execution. At precisely 4 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. They did not knock. They simply paraded into my sanctuary as if they had built it themselves. Desmond led the pack. His chest puffed out in a tailored navy suit that screamed of desperate newly acquired credit. Vivian followed closely behind, draped in ostentatious designer labels, her chin tilted up in a posture of supreme unearned victory. Trey and Lauren flanked them, looking like a couple who had just won the lottery. Lauren was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, clutching a crocodile skin handbag that I knew she had purchased using Desmond's embezzled retirement funds. But they were not alone. Trailing behind them was a man I did not recognize. He wore a shiny, ill-fitting silver suit and carried a battered leather briefcase. He had the distinct greasy aura of a strip mall attorney who made his living chasing ambulances and threatening small business owners. "Take a seat," I said, gesturing to the plush leather chairs opposite me. My voice was perfectly flat, revealing absolutely nothing. Desmond unbuttoned his suit jacket and dropped into the center chair, steepling his fingers on my mahogany table. He looked around the room, taking in the panoramic skyline view and the expensive modern art on the walls. "Nice setup you have here, Zuri," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "A little flashy for my taste, but it gets the job done. I am glad you finally came to your senses and realized how this family operates." I did not offer them water. I did not offer them coffee. I simply sat down next to Isaiah, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "You brought a guest," I noted, staring directly at the man in the silver suit. I explicitly stated that this was a private family matter. The man stepped forward and aggressively dropped his briefcase onto the polished wood. He did not bother to introduce himself professionally. He simply popped the latches and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "I am Gary Vance, legal counsel for your father and your brother," he announced, his voice raspy and loud. "We received your text message regarding the $50,000 settlement. But after reviewing the scope of your corporate assets and the immense psychological distress my clients have suffered due to your recent hostility, we have decided to amend the terms of our agreement." He slid a stapled contract across the table. It stopped exactly inches from my hands. I did not look at the paper. I looked at Trey. "You are amending the terms," I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "You crashed my private gala, threatened to leak forged psychiatric evaluations to my corporate partners to sabotage my merger, and demanded $50,000. And now you are amending the terms." Lauren leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She flashed a terrifyingly artificial smile. "We realized that $50,000 is pocket change for someone in your tax bracket, Zuri. We did our research. Your firm is about to merge for over $100 million. Giving us a tiny cash payout is practically an insult to the sacrifices this family made for you." Gary the lawyer tapped the contract with his pen. "We are no longer asking for a one-time cash payment," he stated loudly. "My clients are demanding a 10% equity stake in your cybersecurity firm. We consider it retroactive compensation. They provided the genetic material and the tough love necessary to give you the drive to succeed. Without their decision to surrender you to the state, you never would have developed the survival instincts required to build this empire. Therefore, they are entitled to 10% of your total valuation." The sheer absolute delusion in the room was suffocating. They were actively attempting to extort a 10% ownership stake in a 9-figure tech company by claiming their child abandonment was actually a brilliant motivational strategy. Isaiah sat perfectly still beside me. Not a single muscle in his face moved, but I could feel the lethal predatory energy radiating from him. The hidden cameras were capturing every single word of this glorious self-incriminating monologue. Desmond leaned back in his chair, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "It is just business, Zuri. You understand business. We gave you the hunger to win. Now it is time to pay your investors." Before I could even formulate a response to that breathtaking level of narcissism, Vivian dramatically placed her hand over her chest. She took a deep, shuddering breath, actively forcing tears to well up in her eyes. It was time for her theatrical performance. "It broke my heart to leave you at that group home." "Zuri," Vivian cried, her voice trembling with entirely manufactured grief. "I cried for months. I did not want to let you go. But I knew in my spirit that it was God's plan. God told me that you needed to struggle so you could become this powerful, wealthy woman. The Lord orchestrated your pain so that today, 30 years later, you would have the resources to save your older brother's logistics company. This is destiny, Zuri. You are fulfilling your divine purpose by giving us this equity." She reached across the table, attempting to grab my hand. I slowly pulled my hands back, letting her manicured fingers grasp empty air. Lauren let out a loud, highly irritated sigh. She dramatically checked her diamond watch, rolling her eyes at her mother-in-law's religious monologue. "Can we please wrap this up, Lauren?" demanded her voice sharp and impatient. I am glad we are all healing and talking about destiny, but we have a dinner reservation at Atlas in exactly 45 minutes. They hold a Michelin star, and they absolutely will not hold our table if we are late. Zuri just signed the contract so we can get out of here. We all know you are not going to risk your precious merger over 10%. Just sign it and we will shred the psych evals tonight. She was rushing an extortion deal because she was hungry. The utter disrespect was the exact catalyst I needed. I looked at the four of them. Desmond puffed up with patriarchal pride, Vivian wiping away fake tears of divine justification, Trey sweating slightly, but nodding along with his wife, and Lauren tapping her nails against the table, completely blind to the fact that she was sitting inside a digital slaughterhouse. I reached out and picked up the contract Gary had slid across the table. I held it up between my hands, feeling the weight of the thick paper. I looked directly into the hidden camera lens embedded in the smoke detector above Desmond's head, ensuring my face was perfectly framed. Then I gripped the top of the pages and ripped the entire contract exactly in half. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the pristine boardroom. Desmond jumped. Gary's mouth dropped open. I stacked the two halves together and ripped them again, tearing their multi-million-dollar equity demand into useless, jagged confetti. I opened my hands and let the pieces flutter down onto the polished hardwood floor. Lauren slammed her hands on the table, her face turning a mottled shade of red. "What is wrong with you?" she screamed. "You are going to ruin everything. I will send those files to the press right now. I will destroy your life." I reached down beneath the edge of the mahogany table. I picked up the four thick black leather folders that Isaiah had meticulously prepared the night before. I placed them on the table and forcefully slid one directly in front of each of them. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly echoing calm. "But you are." Gary, the strip mall lawyer, stared at the pieces of his aggressively drafted extortion contract, currently resting like discarded trash on the expensive hardwood floor. He blinked rapidly, his cheap silver suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his shrinking posture. He reached for his battered leather briefcase, his fingers twitching against the handle, as if he were seriously considering packing up his belongings and sprinting for the exit. He was a bottom-feeding attorney who made his living bullying small business owners and frightening people who did not understand the law. He had clearly never been in a room with someone who possessed absolute, unshakable power. Desmond, however, did not possess the situational awareness to recognize a fatal tactical error. He scoffed loudly, waving a hand dismissively at the shredded paper by his feet. He leaned forward and grabbed the thick black leather folder I had placed in front of him. "You think sliding a fancy binder across a table intimidates me," Desmond sneered, pulling the folder closer. "You can rip up all the contracts you want, Zuri. It does not change the fact that we hold the medical records. You are going to pay us for the privilege of our silence. You owe us this equity." "Open it," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Desmond flipped the heavy leather cover open. Vivian leaned over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she tried to inspect the contents. Gary, the lawyer, stretched his neck, craning to see what kind of counteroffer I had supposedly prepared. The color drained from Desmond's face instantly. The smug, patriarchal arrogance that had defined his entire existence vanished completely, entirely replaced by a sickly, ashen pallor. He stared at the topmost document, his breathing suddenly becoming shallow and rapid. Isaiah tapped a command into his tablet. The massive interactive presentation screen mounted on the wall behind me flared to life, casting a bright, clinical glow over the mahogany table. It mirrored the exact document Desmond was currently holding in his trembling hands. "Let us take a walk down memory lane," I announced, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the boardroom. "The document you are looking at is a certified bank transcript, dated October 14, 1996. It was generated exactly 1 week before you abandoned a terrified 4-year-old girl in a state-run group home. On that specific Tuesday morning at exactly 9:14, you and Vivian walked into a regional bank branch in downtown Atlanta." I paused behind Desmond's chair, projecting my voice clearly for the hidden cameras embedded in the ceiling. "You sat down with a branch manager?" I continued, maintaining my clinical tone. You presented forged medical invoices from a pediatric psychiatric clinic, the same clinic that conveniently generated the fabricated behavioral evaluations you are currently attempting to use to extort me. You claimed your daughter required extensive residential psychiatric care and that the financial burden was ruining your family. You used those fraudulent medical invoices to justify breaking the seal on an irrevocable trust fund that my biological grandfather Marcus Vance had established for me at birth. Vivian let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She pulled her hand away from Desmond's shoulder and pressed it tightly against her mouth. Her wide, panicked eyes darted between the projected bank statements on the screen and my face. You initiated a wire transfer of exactly $250,000, I said, tapping the polished wood of the table to emphasize the number. You routed those funds through a hastily constructed shell company and then directly into your own personal checking account. 2 days later, you used that exact sum of stolen money as a massive cash down payment on a sprawling luxury property in Buckhead, the very same house you currently reside in. And then exactly 5 days after securing your dream home, you surrendered me to the state. You traded your daughter for real estate. Desmond slammed the folder shut, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep his fingers flat against the leather cover. He let out a harsh, nervous laugh that echoed weakly in the cavernous room. He looked at his lawyer silently, pleading for an intervention, but Gary was staring at the presentation screen, with his mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the federal crimes displayed in high definition. "This is ridiculous," Desmond stammered, attempting to force a commanding tone back into his voice. "You dug up some old bank records from 30 years ago. So what? You cannot touch us, Zuri. It is ancient history." He leaned back in his chair, puffing his chest out in a desperate display of bravado. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "I know the law," he declared, his voice rising in panic. "The statute of limitations on wire fraud and embezzlement is 5 years. Maybe 10, depending on the jurisdiction. But 30 years? You are bluffing. You cannot prosecute someone for a financial crime that happened 3 decades ago. You brought us all the way down here to try and scare us with expired paperwork." I stopped pacing. I stood at the head of the table and rested my palms flat against the mahogany surface. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto Desmond's sweating face. I smiled, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "Criminal fraud, yes," I agreed, my voice dropping into a deadly velvet whisper. "The state cannot press criminal charges after 30 years, but civil liability is an entirely different legal mechanism, Desmond. And the civil liability for a stolen, irrevocable trust belonging to a minor falls under the doctrine of equitable tolling." Gary the lawyer suddenly groaned. He slumped back into his chair, dragging a hand down his face as the realization hit him. He understood exactly what I was about to say. "The statute of limitations on a stolen trust does not begin to tick until the victim actually discovers the theft," I explained, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "Because you hid the existence of the trust, and because the state sealed my records upon my entry into the foster system, I had no reasonable way of knowing that money ever existed. I did not discover the theft 30 years ago, Desmond. I discovered it on Tuesday." Vivian's breathing hitched. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. "Which means the statute of limitations officially began ticking 48 hours ago," I continued, standing up straight. "And a stolen trust fund does not just demand restitution of the original principal amount. The law requires you to pay back the principal plus 30 years of standard market compound interest. It also allows for severe punitive damages for the intentional defrauding of a minor." Isaiah tapped his tablet again. The screen behind me shifted, displaying a harsh red financial calculation. $250,000 compounded over 3 decades, under standard S&P 500 index rates alongside standard legal penalties, totals exactly $2.8 million, I announced. Desmond choked on his own breath. He gripped his chest, his eyes bulging as he stared at the staggering number glowing on the monitor. "My corporate legal team filed the civil lawsuit at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," I stated, walking slowly back toward my chair. The judge reviewed the banking transcripts and immediately granted our request for an emergency asset freeze. We already placed a hostile lien on your Buckhead house, Desmond. You cannot sell it. You cannot refinance it. You cannot borrow a single dime against the equity. I looked directly at Trey, who was staring at his father in absolute horror, which means I added my voice, slicing through the silence like a scalpel. You cannot use the house as collateral to pay off the underground shadow syndicate currently threatening to break your legs, Trey. The house is locked. The assets are frozen. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. Vivian shattered. The sophisticated, pious facade she had worn for decades evaporated in an instant. She slammed her hands onto the table and shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "You cannot do this to us!" Vivian screamed, tears of pure, selfish terror streaming down her heavily made-up face. "We are your family, Zuri. We gave you life. You cannot take our home. You cannot throw us out onto the street. We are your blood. How can you be so vicious to your own blood?" I stared dead into her hysterical, weeping eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I only felt the cold, clean closure of a wound that had finally been cauterized. "You stopped being my blood the day you traded me for a down payment," I replied, my voice absolutely void of sympathy. "You made your choice 30 years ago, Vivian. I am simply delivering the receipt." Lauren, who had been remarkably quiet during the entire exchange, suddenly stood up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were calculating, rapidly running the disastrous math in her head. She realized that with the Buckhead house frozen and Trey's logistics company drowning in syndicate debt, the money she had planned to embezzle for her secret Paris escape route was effectively gone. The well was completely dry. "This is insane," Lauren snapped, grabbing her crocodile skin handbag. She glared at Desmond and Vivian with total disgust. "You two are absolute idiots. I am not staying here for this. Trey, we are leaving right now. Get up." Trey did not move. He was staring at the black leather folder sitting untouched in front of him. He looked sick, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. I turned my attention entirely away from the ruined parents and focused completely on the golden child. I offered Trey a dark, knowing smile. "You cannot leave yet, Lauren," I said, gesturing casually toward the table. "The main event has not even started." I turned to my brother. "But wait, Trey. You haven't opened your folder yet." Trey stared at the black leather folder resting on the polished mahogany wood. His hands were visibly shaking. He reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. He braced himself, expecting to see the foreclosure notices or the violent, threatening ledgers from the Marietta Shadow Syndicate. He expected to see a comprehensive list of his own failures. Instead, the first page was a perfectly crisp, high-definition printout of an international wire transfer. Trey blinked, leaning closer to the document. He flipped to the next page. It was another transfer, then another. He traced the routing numbers with his index finger, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The origin accounts were his own business checking accounts. The destinations were a complex web of offshore holding companies. I watched Lauren from the corner of my eye. The arrogant, impatient smirk completely melted off her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like chalk. She recognized the specific formatting of the Swiss banking documents Isaiah had intercepted. She reached out instinctively, her manicured fingers clawing at the edge of Trey's folder. Trey snatched the folder away from her, holding it closer to his chest. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice thick with confusion. "These are my business loan disbursements. Why are they being routed to Geneva?" "Geneva is just a layover, Trey," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent boardroom. "A digital washing machine designed to scrub the origin of the funds before they reach their final destination." Turn to page 4. Trey flipped the pages. His eyes widened. "Your logistics company is not failing because of market conditions or poor management," Trey, I explained, resting my hands on the table. "It is failing because it is being systematically hollowed out from the inside. For the past 8 months, Lauren has been acting as your shadow bookkeeper. She created phantom vendors and dummy contractors. Every time you secured a new high-interest loan from the underground syndicate to keep your trucks running, she immediately siphoned 60% of the capital into a private encrypted account. Trey looked at his wife. Lauren was completely frozen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Isaiah stepped forward, tapping his tablet to project the final destination of the funds onto the massive monitor behind me. A series of banking crests and property deeds illuminated the room. The money bounced from Switzerland directly into an untraceable trust established in the Cayman Islands. I continued methodically breaking down her entire operation. She isolated your capital, completely stripping you of the assets you needed to pay back your dangerous lenders. She booked a first-class ticket to Paris for this Saturday morning. But Paris is just a connection flight. Her final destination is Marbella. She used your stolen business loans and Desmond's depleted retirement funds to purchase a beachfront villa in Spain entirely in cash. The boardroom was dead silent. Even Gary, the strip mall lawyer, had backed away from the table, pressing himself against the far wall to distance himself from the catastrophic implosion of his clients. She isn't planning on saving your house, Trey, I said, my tone razor-sharp and devoid of any pity. She is planning on leaving you with the syndicate debt while she relocates to a beachfront villa in Spain. The $50,000 she demanded from me today was just the final petty cash she needed for walking around money in Europe. Trey slowly turned his head to look at Lauren. The absolute betrayal in his eyes was visceral. He had spent his entire life being the protected golden child, shielded from consequence by his parents. He had never experienced the sharp, agonizing sting of being used and discarded by someone he trusted. He was finally feeling exactly what I had felt at 4 years old. Lauren, tell me this is a lie, Trey whispered, his voice cracking. Tell me you are not stealing from me. We are supposed to be a team. We are supposed to save the company together. Lauren stared at the projected documents on the screen. She looked at the Cayman Islands trust account bearing her maiden name. She looked at the deed to the Spanish villa. The undeniable digital proof of her crimes left her absolutely no room to maneuver or manipulate. The trap had closed flawlessly around her. The silence stretched for 10 excruciating seconds. Then something inside Lauren completely snapped. The sweet, supportive wife facade she had maintained for years vanished in an instant. Her posture changed, shifting from cornered panic to vicious, aggressive hostility. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Save the company!" Lauren mocked, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "There is no company, Trey. There is just a warehouse full of leased trucks you cannot afford to maintain, and a mountain of underground debt you are too stupid to manage. You are a broke, pathetic loser." Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "How dare you speak to my son that way?" Vivian cried out, finding a brief spark of her usual maternal indignation. "He gave you a beautiful life. We welcomed you into this family with open arms." Lauren whipped her head around to glare at Vivian. "Shut up, Vivian. Do not lecture me about family. I sat through your agonizing Sunday dinners and listened to you brag about your non-existent wealth for 5 miserable years. You and Desmond projected this grand illusion of a corporate dynasty. You drove luxury cars and threw country club parties. I thought I was marrying into a legitimate legacy. I thought I was securing my future." Lauren turned back to Trey, jabbing a finger toward his chest. "But you have nothing. Your parents are drowning in debt, and you are a complete failure. You burned through investments like a child playing with matches. I spent 5 years smiling and playing the perfect corporate wife while I watched you systematically destroy our finances. I realized 6 months ago that if I stayed tied to you, I would end up bankrupt or dead at the hands of the loan sharks you were stupid enough to borrow from." Trey shrank back into his leather chair, looking as though he had been physically struck. "You are my wife," he repeated weakly. "I am a survivor," Lauren snarled, grabbing her crocodile skin handbag from the table. "I saw the ship sinking, and I built a lifeboat. You and your parents are a house of cards propped up by stolen trust funds and fake country club memberships. Zuri is the only one in this miserable gene pool who actually knows how to build real wealth." Lauren looked directly at me. Her eyes narrowed with a toxic mixture of hatred and reluctant respect. "You win, Zuri. You have the security footage. You have the offshore routing numbers. You completely outplayed me. She turned on her heel, her designer shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she marched toward the frosted glass doors. She did not look back at Trey. She did not look at Desmond or Vivian. She was cutting her losses and abandoning the wreckage exactly as she had planned to do on Saturday morning. But as she reached out to grab the stainless steel handle of the boardroom door, Isaiah tapped a final command into his tablet. The heavy magnetic locks on the glass doors engaged with a loud, echoing thud. The security system sealed the perimeter instantly. Lauren yanked on the handle. It did not budge. She rattled the door, turning back to face me with a sudden flash of genuine terror in her eyes. "Open the door, Zuri," she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "I am leaving. You proved your point. Open the door. Open." I remained standing at the head of the table, adjusting my emerald silk cuffs. I offered her a serene, immaculate smile. "I told you, Lauren, I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I certainly do not let them walk out the front door with millions of dollars in stolen capital." I picked up the remote control for the boardroom blinds and pressed a single button. The heavy mechanical shades slowly rose, revealing the interior hallway of the corporate suite. Standing directly outside the frosted glass doors were two federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, flanked by my lead corporate counsel, Marcus. "You are not going to Spain, Lauren," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the room. "You are going to federal lockup. And Trey, I highly suggest you and your parents start reading the documents in those folders, because the line for your prosecution starts right behind her." Lauren was pounding her fists against the frosted glass of the boardroom doors. Her diamond rings clattered harshly against the reinforced pane, but the magnetic locks did not yield a single millimeter. Outside, in the softly lit corridor, the two federal agents stood like statues, completely indifferent to her escalating hysteria. Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, simply checked his watch. Lauren spun around, her face contorted into a mask of feral panic. She marched back toward the mahogany table, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at Trey. "Fix this!" Lauren shrieked, her voice cracking. "Call someone! Call your parents' country club friends! Call a judge! You dragged me into this miserable, bankrupt family, and you are not going to let me take the fall for your amateur financial crimes." Trey remained glued to his leather chair, staring blankly at the Swiss bank routing numbers I had provided. He was completely catatonic. His entire reality was short-circuiting. The woman he loved had been stealing from him, and the sister he despised held his literal freedom in her hands. Vivian, however, refused to accept defeat. Her survival mechanism was pure aggressive denial. She pushed her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. She lunged forward, placing herself between her catatonic son and her enraged daughter-in-law. "Do not speak to my son that way," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic maternal fury. "You are nothing but a parasitic gold digger. We welcomed you into this family. We gave you our name, and you repay us by embezzling from his business like a common street thief." "Your name?" Lauren laughed, a harsh barking sound that held absolutely no humor. "The Vance name is financially radioactive. Your husband's retirement accounts are empty because he mortgaged everything to keep up appearances. Your son is a glorified delivery driver who borrows money from back alley loan sharks because actual banks laugh him out of the lobby. I took that money because it was the only way I was getting any return on my investment in this pathetic circus." "You are a monster!" Vivian screamed, raising her hand as if she might actually strike Lauren across the face. "I am a realist," Lauren shot back, leaning in closer. "And right now the reality is that your entire family is going to a federal penitentiary." Vivian turned away from Lauren, her chest heaving with indignation. She looked down at Trey, who was still staring at the table, completely useless. Realizing her golden boy was paralyzed, she pivoted to the only other source of authority she had ever relied on. She marched over to Desmond. Desmond was staring at the shredded pieces of the extortion contract scattered around his expensive leather shoes. He looked numb. "Desmond, get up!" Vivian demanded, grabbing him by the shoulder of his tailored navy suit and shaking him. "Do you hear what this horrible woman is saying to us? Do you see what Zuri is trying to do? She is trying to destroy our son. She is trying to steal our home." Desmond blinked slowly, lifting his gaze to meet his wife's frantic eyes. "Do something," Desmond, Vivian pleaded, her voice rising to a fever pitch. Call Gary, have him file an injunction, call the governor. We know people. We have influence. We have to protect Trey. He is the future of this family. He is your legacy. We cannot let her ruin our only real heir. Gary, the strip mall lawyer, had completely retreated to the far corner of the boardroom, attempting to blend in with the potted ficus plant. He was not filing an injunction for anyone. He was silently calculating how quickly he could surrender his legal license to avoid becoming a co-conspirator. I watched Vivian frantically shake her husband, demanding he use his non-existent power to save their precious bloodline. It was the perfect, beautiful crescendo to a 30-year symphony of lies. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The quiet scrape of the chair legs against the floor was enough to draw everyone's attention. I walked slowly down the length of the mahogany table, stopping directly across from Desmond and Vivian. "Protect your heir, Desmond," I asked, tilting my head slightly. Vivian glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "You are just jealous, Zuri. You have always been jealous of him. You can build all the companies you want, but you will never be him. He is a Vance. He is the true son." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. It echoed through the massive corporate space, bouncing off the glass walls. "I am not jealous, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute clinical detachment. "I am simply amazed by your audacity. You have spent 3 decades feeding your husband a delusion so profound it dictated the entire trajectory of my life." I reached across the table and placed my hand flat on the closed black leather folder sitting in front of Desmond. I tapped the heavy cover twice. "Open it again, Desmond," I commanded. "Skip the banking ledgers. Skip the wire fraud transcripts. Turn directly to the last page." Desmond hesitated, his eyes darting between my face and the folder. His hands were still trembling, but the authoritative tone in my voice compelled him to obey. He slowly pulled the folder toward his chest and flipped it open. He bypassed the financial ruin and landed on the final document. "What is this?" Desmond muttered, his brow furrowing as he stared at the faded, digitized scan. "This is a hospital intake form. It is from 1990. That is the neonatal blood registry from the exact day your golden child was born," I explained, resting my hands on the edge of the table. Isaiah did not even have to hack a secured server to find it. It is public municipal record archived by the Fulton County Health Department. I want you to read the biological data out loud, Desmond." Vivian suddenly froze. Her frantic energy evaporated in a millisecond. The blood drained from her face so rapidly, her skin took on a gray, sickly hue. She stared at the paper in Desmond's hands, as if it were a live grenade. "Zuri, stop!" Vivian choked out, her voice suddenly small and terrified. "That is private medical information. You have no right to look at that. Read it, Desmond," I repeated, entirely ignoring her. Desmond swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the faded typewritten text. "Maternal blood type O. Negative." He read, his voice raspy. "Paternal blood type A. B positive." "Correct," I said, nodding encouragingly, like a teacher guiding a slow student through a basic equation. "That is the biological baseline you and Vivian established. Now read the neonatal blood type recorded for the infant. Read Trey's blood type." Desmond moved his finger down the page. He squinted as if the letters were suddenly written in a foreign language. "Neonatal blood type," Desmond read, pausing for a fraction of a second. "O positive." I watched the exact moment the biological reality collided with 30 years of patriarchal pride. I watched the gears in his mind grind to a violent, catastrophic halt. "I am a cybersecurity architect, Desmond. But you do not need an advanced degree in encryption to decode basic genetic mathematics," I said, my voice ringing through the absolute silence of the room. "A mother with an O-negative blood type and a father with an AB-positive blood type can only produce a child with an A or a B blood type. The presence of the O allele in the child requires both parents to carry it. An AB parent does not carry the O allele. It is a biological absolute." I leaned forward, bracing my weight on my hands, bringing my face closer to his. You might want to ask Vivian who Trey's real father is. I whispered, a cold, merciless smile touching the corners of my mouth. Because scientifically, it is not you. The boardroom went entirely dead. The silence was so profound, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. Trey slowly lifted his head, looking at me with an expression of total vacant incomprehension. Lauren had stopped demanding the doors be opened. She was staring at Vivian, her mouth slightly parted, taking in the sheer nuclear devastation of the secret. Desmond did not move. He stared at the faded document in his hands. His eyes traced the letters over and over again. O negative, a B positive, O positive. He was a man who had built his entire identity around his bloodline. He had thrown away his legally adopted daughter because she did not carry his DNA. He had stolen $250,000 from a toddler to buy a mansion for his true heir. He had bankrupted himself, covering the debts of a son he believed was his own flesh and blood. The golden child legacy that justified my abandonment was built on a 33-year-old lie. Vivian Desmond whispered, his voice breaking. He did not look at her. He just kept staring at the paper. Vivian, what is this? What does this mean? Vivian was shaking violently. She reached out, grabbing Desmond's forearm with desperate, clawing fingers. It is a mistake, Vivian babbled, tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. It is a clerical error, Desmond. You know how those hospitals were back then. The nurses were careless. They mixed up the charts. Zuri fabricated this. She hacked the system to print a fake document to tear our family apart. Do not listen to her. He is your son. Isaiah stepped out from the shadows near the corner of the room. He stood tall. His broad shoulders squared, his expression carved from stone. I did not fabricate a single pixel, Isaiah stated, his deep voice resonating with absolute authority. I pulled the digital scan from the municipal archives, and then I drove down to the county records office and secured the original carbon copy. We have the physical paper signed by the attending physician in a fireproof safe. There was no clerical error. There was no mix-up. You had an affair 33 years ago, and you passed another man's child off as the Vance heir. Desmond slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The paper slipped from his hands and landed softly on the mahogany table. He looked at Vivian's panicked, sweating face. He looked at her desperate, clawing hands. Then he turned and looked at Trey. He really looked at him. He looked at the shape of Trey's jaw, the set of his eyes, the complete lack of any shared physical characteristics that Desmond had always proudly attributed to his wife's side of the family. The decades of financial drain, the constant bailouts, the utter lack of business acumen. It all snapped into a horrifying, sickening focus. He had sacrificed his soul, his morals, and his finances for a bastard child. Desmond's face twisted into an expression of pure animalistic rage. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His breathing became a harsh, ragged wheeze. You lied to me! Desmond roared, a sound so loud and full of agony that it rattled the glass walls of the boardroom. He lunged. Desmond threw his entire body weight forward, flipping the heavy leather executive chair backward onto the floor. He lunged directly across the table, his hands outstretched, reaching for Vivian's throat. Vivian shrieked, stumbling backward and tripping over the legs of her own chair. She crashed to the floor, scrambling frantically backward like a cornered crab, her designer heels sliding uselessly against the polished hardwood. Desmond, no, please, she screamed, covering her face with her arms. Before Desmond could scramble over the mahogany table, Isaiah moved. He closed the distance in 3 rapid strides, grabbing Desmond by the back of his tailored suit jacket and hauling him backward with effortless, brutal strength. He slammed Desmond down onto the hardwood floor, pressing a heavy knee into the man's shoulder blade, pinning him completely to the ground. Stay down, Isaiah commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Desmond thrashed wildly against the floor, gasping for air, tears of rage and absolute devastation pouring down his face. 30 years, he sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic wail. You ruined my life. You ruined my legacy. I stood at the head of the table, watching the physical and psychological destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I felt entirely, completely clean. I pulled a small silver remote from my pocket and pressed a button. The magnetic locks on the frosted glass doors disengaged with a sharp click. The doors swung wide open, revealing the two federal agents and my corporate counsel waiting in the corridor. "Gentlemen," I said, gesturing to the wreckage of the Vance family scattered across my boardroom floor. "They are all yours. All." The two federal agents stepped into the boardroom, moving with the swift, synchronized efficiency of predators who had already cornered their prey. Marcus, my corporate counsel, silently handed the lead agent a thick encrypted flash drive containing every single offshore routing number dummy corporation ledger and forged invoice Lauren had generated over the past 8 months. Yeah. Tss. Lauren did not go quietly. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around her wrists, her polished high society facade completely disintegrated. She screamed viciously, thrashing against the agents as they dragged her toward the corridor. She hurled every conceivable insult at Trey, cursing his name, cursing his family, and cursing the day she ever met him. Her voice echoed violently down the pristine corporate hallway until the heavy frosted glass doors finally slid shut, sealing the boardroom once again. Inside the room, the atmosphere was absolute pure pandemonium. Desmond was still pinned flat against the hardwood floor beneath Isaiah's heavy knee. He was no longer struggling to attack his wife. Instead, he was weeping. It was a pathetic, hollow sound. The formidable, untouchable patriarch who had dictated my entire existence was reduced to a sobbing, broken shell. His entire legacy, his bloodline, his justification for throwing me away, had just been completely incinerated. Vivian was on her hands and knees, her designer dress bunched up around her thighs, her hair clinging to her sweating face. She was crawling toward Desmond, desperately pawing at his suit jacket. She was babbling uncontrollably, a frantic stream of excuses and justifications about how lonely she had been 33 years ago, how Desmond was always working, how it meant nothing, how Trey was still his son in every way that mattered. Trey sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the space where his wife had been standing just moments before. He looked at his mother groveling on the floor. He looked at his father weeping in total devastation. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the reality of his existence crushed the remaining oxygen out of his lungs. The noise was chaotic, it was sloppy, it was entirely undignified. I stood at the head of the mahogany table watching them writhe in the exact same toxic trauma they had forced upon me for 3 decades. I let them suffocate in it for a few more seconds. Then I raised my hand and slammed my palm flat against the heavy mahogany table. The sound cracked through the air, echoing off the glass walls like a gunshot. The pandemonium ceased instantly. Vivian flinched, throwing her hands over her head. Desmond gasped, choking on a sob. Trey jolted in his seat, his eyes snapping toward me. "Get up!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute lethal authority. I nodded to Isaiah. He smoothly stood up, removing his weight from Desmond's back, and stepped away, folding his arms across his chest. Desmond wheezed, rolling over and painfully dragging himself up from the floor. He collapsed into the nearest chair, refusing to even look in Vivian's direction. Vivian scrambled up, pulling her ruined dress down and clutching the edge of the table for support. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out the pathetic stapled extortion contract they had brought to my office. I pulled out my actual settlement document. It was a thick, pristine, legally binding contract, drafted by the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state of Georgia. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "The theatrics are over," I announced, resting my fingertips against the polished wood. "You came here today to extort me for a 10% equity stake in a 9-figure company. You threatened to sabotage my merger with forged psychiatric evaluations. You believed you held the power. You were mathematically, historically, and entirely incorrect." I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto Desmond. He looked up at me, his face utterly hollowed out by betrayal. "Here is your only way out," I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, unyielding whisper. "Desmond Vivian, you will sign over the deed to the Buckhead house to me today, right now." You stole $250,000 from an irrevocable trust established in my name to purchase that property. That theft compounded over 30 years, totals exactly $2.8 million. You do not have the liquidity to pay me back. Your retirement accounts are empty. Therefore, you will surrender the real estate to settle the debt you owe me. Vivian let out a strangled gasp. Zuri, please, she begged, her voice trembling with fresh tears. That house is everything we have. My friends are in that neighborhood. The country club is right down the street. Where will we go? We will have absolutely nothing. You will have exactly what you gave me when you abandoned me in a state-run facility. Vivian, I replied, completely devoid of pity. Nothing. You will pack your belongings by Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, my real estate holding company will officially take possession of the property. You will quietly resign from your country club, and you will disappear from my city. If you attempt to fight this transfer in court, I will unfreeze the assets just long enough to publicly drag you through a civil trial that will expose the embezzlement, the paternity fraud, and the extortion to every single one of your high society friends. I turned my gaze to Trey. He shrank back into his seat, visibly trembling. Trey. I said his name like a curse. The golden child, the fake heir, the man who crashed my gala and tried to ruin my life because he was too incompetent to manage his own logistics company. I reached out and slid a separate stack of papers directly in front of him. You will sign a permanent restraining order, I instructed, my voice sharp and precise. You will legally forfeit any right to contact me, approach my corporate offices, or interfere with my business operations ever again. Furthermore, you will sign a full legally binding confession detailing your extortion attempt. You will admit in writing that you and your parents fabricated those medical records and psychiatric evaluations to blackmail a corporate executive. Trey stared at the confession document, his eyes wide with terror. Zuri, if I sign this, he stammered, his voice shaking. If I put this in writing, I could be prosecuted. I could go to jail. You are entirely missing the point, Trey, I countered smoothly. I stepped away from the head of the table and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I gestured toward the glass walls of the boardroom, pointing out toward the expansive corporate lobby beyond the frosted doors. The federal agents who just escorted your wife out of this building were exclusively focused on international wire fraud and offshore tax evasion, I explained, turning back to face the three of them. But sitting down in my main lobby on the ground floor drinking espresso by the reception desk are four detectives from the Atlanta Police Department White-Collar Crime Division. Desmond closed his eyes, burying his face in his trembling hands. If you don't sign, I said, projecting my voice so it commanded every square inch of the room I call the Atlanta Police waiting in my lobby. I hand over the extortion evidence and the embezzlement files, and you all go to prison. I walked back to the table and tapped the surface right next to the pristine settlement documents. I will hand them the video and audio recordings of this entire meeting, I continued relentlessly. I will hand them the forged clinic invoices you used to break my trust fund in 1996. I will hand them the psychiatric evaluations you brought here today to blackmail me. I will hand them a perfectly documented bow-tied case of felony extortion and historical fraud. You will be arrested before you even reach the parking garage. You will be wearing orange jumpsuits by midnight. I looked at the three of them. The absolute ruin was complete. They had walked into my sanctuary expecting to bully a wounded child. They had completely failed to realize they were stepping into a digital slaughterhouse designed by an apex predator. Sign the deed to the house and sign the confession, I commanded. You lose your wealth and you lose your pride, but you get to walk out of this building in your own clothes. Isaiah stepped forward. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black digital timer. He placed it directly in the center of the mahogany table, right next to the settlement contracts. He tapped the top button. A bright red digital display illuminated, reading exactly 6000. The numbers instantly ticked down to 5959. You have exactly 60 seconds, I said, folding my arms across my chest. The silence in the room was deafening, entirely consumed by the rapid, relentless ticking of the digital clock. 55, 54, 53. Desmond stared at the ticking red numbers. He looked at the Buckhead deed transfer. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely lift them from his lap. He had lost his son. He had lost his wife's loyalty. He had lost his money. The only thing he had left to lose was his freedom. 44. Vivian was sobbing silently, her tears dripping onto the polished wood. She looked at Trey silently, begging him to do something to fix the nightmare. But Trey was staring at the confession document, paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own profound incompetence. 29. Isaiah shifted his weight slightly, resting his hand casually near his earpiece, entirely prepared to signal the detectives waiting in the lobby. Desmond let out a ragged, broken sigh. It was the sound of a man entirely surrendering. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the contract. He pulled the deed transfer toward him. He did not read the terms. He simply pressed the pen to the paper and violently scratched his signature across the bottom line. He slid the paper toward Vivian. "Sign it." He rasped, his voice completely devoid of life. "Just sign it, Vivian." Vivian choked on a sob, picking up the pen and scrawling her name next to his, officially signing away her luxury estate, her status, and her entire fraudulent existence. 14. Desmond grabbed the pen from Vivian and practically threw it at Trey. "Sign the confession." He snarled, his eyes flashing with sudden raw hatred toward the man he had called his son for 33 years. "Sign it before she sends us all to a cell." Trey flinched, grabbing the pen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely form the letters, but he managed to drag his signature across the bottom of the restraining order and the extortion confession. 4. Trey dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the table. Isaiah reached forward and pressed the button on the timer, stopping the clock at exactly 2 seconds remaining. He calmly collected the signed documents, verifying the signatures before slipping them seamlessly into his own secure leather portfolio. The transaction was complete. The revenge was absolute. I looked at the 3 people sitting across from me. They were entirely broken. They had nothing left. "Get out of my building," I said. The digital timer glowed a harsh, violent red against the rich mahogany table. The numbers dropped with a silent, flashing rhythm. Desmond stared at the heavy silver pen resting beside the deed transfer. The absolute reality of his situation was fighting a brutal war against his lifelong patriarchal arrogance. "Zuri, we can work this out," Desmond croaked, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of the room. "You are a businesswoman. I am a businessman. We do not need to involve the authorities over a family dispute. Let me keep 20% of the equity in the Buckhead house. 10%. I can liquidate some of my vintage car collection and set up a payment plan for the rest. We can structure a buyout." 50 seconds, I announced out loud, my voice slicing through his pathetic attempt at corporate negotiation. "You are not selling me a piece of real estate, Desmond. You are paying restitution for a federal crime. You broke into a sealed, irrevocable trust belonging to a ward of the state. You stole $250,000. That money, compounded over 3 decades, belongs to me. The house is merely the collateral I am seizing to settle your outstanding debt. There are no payment plans for thieves." The numbers on the timer flashed relentlessly. 45. 44. Vivian let out a strangled, guttural sob. She looked at her husband and saw a broken, powerless old man, incapable of protecting her luxury lifestyle. She twisted around in her chair and grabbed Trey by the lapels of his tailored suit. "Trey, do something!" Vivian shrieked, shaking him violently. "Call your investors. Call the people who fund your logistics company. You have resources. You are Avance. Do not just sit there and let her take our home. Fix this!" Trey slowly turned his head to look at his mother. His eyes were entirely dead, empty voids in a sweating face. "There are no investors, Mom," he whispered, his voice hollow and completely defeated. "There are no resources. My company is a shell." He pointed a trembling finger across the room toward Lauren. "She took it all. She created fake invoices and offshore holding companies. Every time I borrowed money from the syndicate to keep the trucks running, she siphoned it out of the country." The logistics company is bankrupt. The loan sharks are going to kill me. I have nothing. Vivian stared at her son, the complete devastation finally penetrating her thick layer of high society delusion. The money was gone. The legacy was fake. The golden child was ruined. She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. While the family imploded, Lauren saw her window. She slowly, quietly backed away from the table. She clutched her expensive crocodile skin handbag tightly against her ribs, keeping her eyes fixed on the heated argument. She took one step backward, then another, inching her way toward the heavy frosted glass doors. She thought the security lockdown was a bluff. She thought she could simply slip out the door, walk to the elevator, and disappear to the airport before the police realized she was a primary suspect. She reached behind her back, feeling for the stainless steel door handle. Isaiah materialized from the shadows like a phantom. He did not run. He did not rush. He simply stepped perfectly into her path, his massive frame entirely blocking the exit. Lauren gasped, stumbling backward. Isaiah did not say a word. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a thick manila envelope. He held it out, suspending it exactly at Lauren's eye level. "What is this?" Lauren snapped, attempting to maintain her haughty exterior, despite the sheer terror radiating from her rigid posture. "That is a legal summons," I answered from across the room, keeping my eyes locked on the ticking timer. "My corporate investigators did not just find your Cayman Island accounts, Lauren. We tracked the digital signatures back to your personal devices. We documented every single fraudulent wire transfer. The moment you step out of this building, you are going to be served with a massive civil lawsuit for corporate embezzlement and gross financial misconduct. Your Spanish villa will be seized before your flight even lands in Madrid." Trey suddenly snapped out of his catatonic shock. The sight of Lauren clutching the legal summons ignited a sudden, violent spark of vindictive rage inside him. The supportive wife who had constantly belittled his intelligence had played him for an absolute fool. He spun around and slammed his fist onto the table right next to Gary, the strip mall lawyer. Gary jumped, dropping his pen. "Sue her!" Trey screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He grabbed Gary by the shoulder of his cheap silver suit. "Draft the papers right now, Gary. I want her accounts frozen. I want an injunction on that property in Spain. She stole my business loans. She set me up to take the fall with the syndicate. You are my lawyer. Do your job and sue her for every single dime she took." Gary wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. He frantically grabbed his legal pad, his hands shaking as he started scribbling notes. He was desperately trying to figure out how to extract his legal fees from a bankrupt man suing a fugitive wife, while federal agents waited in the hallway. The digital timer beeped a sharp, high-pitched warning sound. "Here is your only way out," I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, unyielding whisper. "Desmond Vivian, you will sign over the deed to the Buckhead house to me today to settle the $2.8 million debt you owe me. Trey, you will sign a permanent restraining order and a full legally binding confession of your extortion attempt regarding the fake medical records." I pointed to the glass walls of the boardroom. "If you don't sign, I call the Atlanta police waiting in my lobby. I hand over the extortion evidence and the embezzlement files, and you all go to prison. You have exactly 60 seconds. Desmond stared at the red numbers flashing toward 0, 10, 9, 8. He looked at the heavy silver pen resting on the mahogany wood. He looked at the deed transfer that would strip him of his multi-million-dollar estate and leave him entirely destitute. He looked at the frosted glass doors, knowing that police detectives were standing exactly 10 feet away waiting for my signal. Shaking with a rage and humiliation so profound it seemed to age him a decade. In 5 seconds, Desmond grabbed the pen. He did not bother to read the legal clauses. He pressed the tip of the pen so hard against the paper that it nearly tore through the thick parchment. He violently dragged his signature across the bottom line, officially surrendering his home, his status, and his stolen wealth. He shoved the document across the table toward Vivian, who weakly added her signature beside his. Trey did not hesitate. Fueled by a toxic mixture of blind terror regarding the police and absolute hatred for his scheming wife, he snatched the pen from his father. He pulled the extortion confession toward him. He signed his name rapidly, authorizing a legally binding admission of guilt regarding the fabricated medical records And the blackmail attempt. He threw the pen down. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. Isaiah stepped forward. He calmly picked up the signed documents, holding them up to the light to verify the signatures. He gave me a single curt nod. He slipped the papers into his secure leather portfolio, securing my victory and my real estate acquisition. I picked up the small remote control from the table. I pressed the central button. The heavy magnetic locks on the frosted glass doors disengaged with a loud, echoing thud. "The transaction is complete," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You are dismissed." For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer gravity of what had just occurred pinned them to their chairs. They had walked into my corporate headquarters expecting to secure a 10% equity stake in a cybersecurity empire. Instead, they were walking out completely bankrupt, entirely humiliated and stripped of every single asset they possessed. Lauren was the first to move. She clutched the manila envelope to her chest, kept her head down, and practically sprinted through the doors, disappearing down the corridor without a single backward glance. Gary, the lawyer, shoved his legal pad into his battered briefcase and scurried out the door, closely following Lauren's escape route. Desmond slowly pushed himself up from the table. His joints seemed stiff, his posture completely defeated. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor as he dragged himself toward the exit. Trey followed his father, walking with the heavy, sluggish steps of a man marching toward a firing squad. The loan sharks were waiting for him, and he no longer had a wife, a business, or a family fortune to hide behind. Vivian was the last to rise. As they packed up their ruined lives to leave, Vivian stopped at the door. She gripped the stainless steel handle, her knuckles turning white. She slowly turned around to face me. The tears had dried, leaving dark, smudged streaks of mascara tracking down her pale cheeks. The pious, sophisticated society matron was completely gone. All that remained was raw, unadulterated venom. She glared at me with pure hatred, her eyes practically vibrating with malice. "You're a monster!" Vivian spat, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. I stood at the head of the boardroom table. I smiled, adjusting my blazer, ensuring the fabric lay perfectly flat against my wrists. I looked directly into her hateful eyes. "No, Vivian," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute crystalline victory. "I'm just a really good investment you threw away. Now get out of my building." Exactly 14 days later, the suffocating Georgia humidity hung heavy over the perfectly manicured lawns of the Buckhead estate. I sat in the back of my idling armored SUV, the dark-tinted windows shielding me from the glaring morning sun. Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, stood at the edge of the circular driveway, flanked by 4 uniformed sheriff deputies. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to execute the immediate and non-negotiable eviction of Desmond and Vivian Vance. The sheer absolute humiliation of the scene unfolding in front of me was cinematic. There were no professional movers in sleek branded trucks. There were no assistants wrapping expensive porcelain in bubble wrap. Desmond and Vivian were entirely bankrupt. Their accounts were frozen, their credit lines were utterly destroyed, and their high society friends had abandoned them the exact second the whispers of federal fraud investigations began circulating through the country club. I watched silently as Desmond struggled out the massive mahogany front doors. He was sweating profusely through a cheap, faded polo shirt, his face flushed a dangerous shade of purple as he strained to carry a heavy cardboard box. He practically dumped it into the open trunk of a severely dented 10-year-old sedan. Vivian followed close behind him. The perfectly coiffed society matron was completely gone. Her hair was pulled back into an untidy knot, and she wore oversized sweatpants. She clutched a garbage bag filled with loose clothing, weeping openly as she practically dragged her feet across the expensive paving stones. Trey was standing near the battered sedan, his shoulders slumped, his eyes constantly darting toward the end of the street as if expecting a convoy of Marietta loan sharks to pull up at any given second. He was entirely alone. Lauren had not waited for the federal indictments to officially drop. The second she left my corporate boardroom 2 weeks ago, she vanished into the wind. She liquidated whatever hidden cash she could access, abandoned her luxury vehicle at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, and boarded a red-eye flight. She left Trey drowning in an ocean of syndicate debt, massive federal legal fees, and the absolute ruin of his fake legacy. Desmond shoved the last garbage bag into the back seat of the sedan. He stood there for a moment staring at the massive faux-columned mansion he had purchased with my stolen trust fund. He looked like a man who had died but forgot to stop breathing. Trey closed the trunk. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. He looked toward my idling SUV. I could see the pathetic, desperate calculation running through his mind. He hesitated, and then slowly began walking across the driveway toward my vehicle. Isaiah, sitting in the front passenger seat, stiffened his hand, reaching toward the door handle. I tapped the glass partition, signaling him to wait. I pressed the button, lowering my tinted window exactly 3 inches. Trey stopped right outside the door. He looked utterly destroyed. His hands were shaking, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "Zuri, please?" Trey begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of his former golden boy arrogance. "I know what we did was wrong. I know Lauren ruined everything, but I have absolutely nothing left. The syndicate is calling my phone every hour. Mom and Dad are moving into a weekly motel off the highway. We have $20 to our name. Please, Zuri, just a small loan, just enough to get me out of the city. We are still siblings. You cannot just watch us die out here." He played the sibling card. He actually invoked the concept of family after attempting to extort my company and sabotage my life. I looked at his sweating, terrified face. I did not feel a single flicker of anger. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing. I did not utter a single word. I simply held his desperate gaze, pressed my finger against the console button, and let the electric motor hum smoothly as the tinted glass rolled up, slicing off his pathetic pleas and sealing him entirely out of my world. Trey stood there staring at the black glass for a long, agonizing moment. Then he turned his head, hanging in total defeat, and walked back to the dented sedan. He climbed into the driver's seat. Desmond and Vivian slid into the back. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally turned over. They drove slowly down the long, winding driveway, pulling out through the wrought iron gates. Their social standing, their wealth, and their fraudulent legacy were completely obliterated overnight. They were driving toward a cramped, run-down roadside motel, and they were never coming back. Marcus walked over to my SUV and tapped the glass. I rolled the window down again. "The property is officially vacated and legally secured. Zuri," Marcus confirmed, handing me the final signed transfer deeds. "What are your instructions for the estate? Do you want me to list it with a luxury broker?" I looked past Marcus at the massive, sprawling mansion. It was a monument to theft. It was the architectural manifestation of the lie that had dictated my childhood. I had absolutely zero intention of keeping it. "No, Marcus," I replied, stepping out of the SUV and feeling the warm Georgia sun on my face. "I am not keeping it, and I am not selling it intact." I raised my right hand and signaled down the street. The low, rumbling growl of heavy diesel engines echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Turning the corner onto the pristine street were 3 massive yellow Caterpillar excavators, flanked by a professional demolition crew. "Tear it down," I ordered, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Bulldoze every single square inch of it into the dirt." The demolition crew did not hesitate. The heavy machinery rolled up the pristine driveway, their massive metal treads crushing the expensive landscaping. I stood beside Isaiah and Marcus, watching as the first excavator raised its hydraulic arm and slammed its steel bucket directly through the front columns of the mansion. The sound of shattering glass, snapping timber, and crushing brick was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I watched the house they bought with my stolen childhood crumble into absolute dust. I did not just destroy their physical home. I sold the cleared prime Buckhead real estate to a commercial luxury developer the very next week for a massive, heavily negotiated profit. I took every single penny of that multi-million-dollar land sale and transferred it directly into a newly established trust. I named it the Gloria Foundation. It was a massive, fully funded initiative designed specifically to provide elite cybersecurity training, full university scholarships, and guaranteed corporate placements strictly for young Black girls aging out of the state foster care system. I took the exact money Desmond and Vivian had stolen to abandon me, and I used it to ensure that hundreds of girls just like me would never have to depend on toxic families to build their own empires. 6 months later, the crystal clear turquoise water of the Indian Ocean lapped gently against the pristine white sand. The warm Maldivian breeze carried the scent of sea salt and orchids. There were no corporate boardrooms. There were no hidden cameras. There were no extortion contracts. There was only the soft, rhythmic sound of the waves. I stood barefoot in the warm sand wearing a simple, elegant white silk gown that caught the ocean breeze. Isaiah stood across from me, looking absolutely devastating in a tailored linen suit. His eyes, the exact same calm, protective harbor they had been since the day we met, held nothing but profound, unwavering love. There were no toxic relatives in attendance. There was no patriarchal grandstanding. There was no drama. Our wedding was entirely private, witnessed only by the local officiant and the quiet beauty of the island. As Isaiah slid the heavy diamond band onto my finger, I looked up at him and took a deep, steadying breath. I thought about the terrified 4-year-old girl sitting in the sterile lobby of a state-run facility, wondering why she was not good enough to be kept. I thought about the 30 years of cold, calculated survival that followed. I did not just survive their rejection. I weaponized it. I monetized their betrayal. I dismantled their hypocrisy with absolute mathematical precision, and I used the rubble to build an untouchable corporate legacy. I had cut the infection out of my life permanently. Blood does not make a family. Shared genetics do not guarantee loyalty, love, or protection. Family is not something you are randomly assigned to endure. Family is the people who stand between you and the fire. It is loyalty. It is respect. It is showing up when the world turns hostile. Isaiah leaned down and kissed me, the warmth of his touch, sealing the final chapter of my past and opening the door to our future. I closed my eyes, leaning into the embrace of my true family, entirely, completely free. The ultimate lesson is that shared blood never makes a family. True love requires respect and support. When toxic relatives belittle your worth, the most powerful revenge isn't anger. It is building your own undeniable success. Financial and emotional independence form your strongest shield. You must find the courage to walk away from those who value you conditionally. Reclaim your narrative, embrace your chosen family, and create a life where you are celebrated. Have you ever cut ties with toxicity to protect your peace? Comment your story below, like this video, and please hit subscribe.